I'll be giving a presentation on the situation of the class struggle in Latin America, with an emphasis in Bolivia and Peru, because there's been some mass mobilizations around there recently. So yeah, so some background or some introduction on this. So the reason why we chose these topics was because there has been there Latin America just has a strong history of mass mobilizations, fighting against various imperialist measures, neoliberalism, and it goes all the way back to the decolonization period. So it's important to point out that Latin America, there's the particular government or regimes that have been in power at times have been it's been called it's termed the pink tide. So pink tide socialism, or socialism in the 21st century, as Chavez first termed it. So these pink tide governments include Chavismo in Venezuela, or Maduro now, Evo Morales in the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism in Bolivia. There's also Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Lula and the Workers' Party, or slash PT, in Brazil. And then we also have Kirchner slash the neo-Peronist in Argentina. So most of these governments have been reformist and social democratic parties that were able to put themselves at the front of the vanguard of various struggles there against various neoliberal measures, various attempts to use debt and austerity on the working and poor masses of these countries. So many of these governments have been able to put themselves at the front, at times opportunistically, well, most of the time, honestly. And most of these have become class collaboration governments. Like, even if some of these have a lot of labor and indigenous support, once they form governments with the other more liberal, neoliberal governments, pretty much all these pink tide governments kind of are part of that can be characterized as that. And most of these pink tide governments were put in a situation where they had to resolve huge debts that mainly these countries were more or less forced to do in the neoliberal era, starting from from the 1970s, 80s, and 80s and on. And many of these governments, even if they were elected to enact progressive measures, they had huge national debts, and they were more or less put at gunpoint by the imperialist institutions of the IMF and World Bank, who used debt to pretty much create more poverty. And so what tends to happen and especially in these semi-colonial countries, is the masses, after deep poverty and years of repression, just reach tipping points. And what tends to happen, they decide, well, we need either mass mobilization. And we saw many of these pink tide governments start to weaken, and some of these are no longer in power, especially after the war recession of 2008 and 2007 to 2008. All right, so I'll go into Bolivia first. So some key background on Bolivia. So Bolivia it's the fifth largest country in South America. It has a big population. It's a multi-ethnic country, like one of the most, has one of the biggest indigenous populations in Latin America. It's around 20% can be considered from the various indigenous peoples. And like most of these Latin American countries, they're semi-colonial countries, so many of the resources that are extracted are the raw resources. So agriculture, all the different vegetables and plants that forestry, mining, and also textile, clothing, other, and also petroleum. So Bolivia it's very rich in minerals like tin, silver, lithium, and copper. And I have here just some slides on the Bolivian Revolution of 1952. So I'm not going to go too much deeply into this, but it's the Bolivian Revolution of 1952 is a very important revolution that eventually was it didn't succeed. Had moments of dual power, and it's one of the few cases, especially before the World War II period, where Trotskyists played a very influential and leading role in this dual power revolution situation. And it's important to know, because the Trotskyist party, which was the POR, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, it still exists today, although it's not as influential as it was. But it it had it caused a lot of discussions and debates in the Trotskyist movement. Yeah, and then so some of the key actors of the 1952 revolution included, besides the POR, also included the MNR, the Nationalist Revolution Movement, which is more of a more of a progressive liberal movement. So it wasn't necessarily socialist. And yeah, like I mean, I'm gonna go too deeply into it, but um, like also out of this revolution, the one of the most influential and biggest trade union federations, the COB, the Bolivian Worker Center, was born. At moments it had it had control of had an influence, and it had moments of dual power, and where there was at times there was debates at the times that the COB should have been the one to take power as opposed to the MNR, which ended up taking power and and install the a bourgeois government, a progressive bourgeois government, but a bourgeois government nonetheless, that eventually was overthrown by a military push. Like many of these countries, whenever there's kind of progressive liberal governments, there tends to be military pushes because these governments try to do agrarian reform or whatever. So, that's more or less what happened in Bolivia. People should look more into the 1952 revolution. It's a very interesting one. And yeah, so I'm going to just kind of highlight another kind of more recent revolutionary class struggle in Bolivia, which was it's called the Water War in Cochabamba. Happened in 1999, around 2000. And yeah, this kind of some background on this. So this is during the neoliberal period. There were attempts of various multinationals to privatize water. It's one of the first attempts to privatize water, and of course, this is during a period where many natural resources and all these other things by the indigenous and working masses of Bolivia had been privatized due to the Bolivian government taking on all this debt, and yeah, the multinationals, they use the IMF and World Bank to say, look, hey, you have this debt, but hey, we have a solution. How about sell us your water, sell us your minerals? So this is what pretty much imperialism is. For those who if you ever read Lenin's imperialism, like it's not just wars, it's by using debt, austerity to extract all the resources, and pretty much Latin America becomes continues to be a semi-colony of the U.S. and European imperialist powers. And you also have like China and other countries involved in the mix now. Yeah, so in 2000 there was huge mobilizations by the indigenous people to stop this privatization. Many of the big trading forces are the coca and coke farmers. Evo Morales was a coca leaf leader, and also the miners. The miners, they played a vanguard role in the 1952 revolution, but they also played a role during this water war in 2000. And yeah, the Evo Morales' MAS was able to put itself in the front of these mobilizations, and it gained a lot of popularity through this. And so that kind of helped give some background of why the MAS eventually was elected to government in 2006. With all this revolutionary upsurge, and it's also like I'm not going to go too deeply into the other pink tide governments, but there were these big, these mass mobilizations were happening throughout Latin America. Like, what happens in other countries, it tends to influence Bolivia. Venezuela was kind of like leading this wave against neoliberalism. So many of these, so it's important that these different mobilizations influence each other. So Evo Morales' government puts himself into power in 2006, promising all these progressive measures. But even in the beginning of that government, even in the beginning, Evo Morales was telling his government was telling the ruling class, like, hey, don't worry about it. We're not gonna, really put, in socialist government here. We're not gonna attack the more transnationals. We're just gonna give a little bit of just a little change here and there to the poor masses. So even in the beginning, like here, I have a quote from from who's now the current president-elect Luis Arce, saying that to the businessman, saying, look, hey, we're if these past 14 years were the best for the multinationals and the rising Bolivian bourgeoisie. So they're not even if they sell themselves as socialists, their actions showed otherwise. Yeah, so this, so yeah, the Mas government was there for 14 years. Yeah, they had some progressive measures they took that helped raise some of the poor masses, but by and large, um, the multinationals were not really expropriated. They weren't really attacked. So, eventually, obviously um, once the war recession started happening in 2007 and 8, the imperialist multinationals started saying like, hey, you have this huge debt, pay up. And yeah, so let's see. Yeah, so starting in 2016, Morales, already on his third term, was trying to change the Bolivian constitution so he could run for a fourth term because there's a three-term limit. But however, this referendum Morales did was rejected by the masses, kind of showing that they're not just going to go in and take the government without any critique. And yeah, so rather than accept this result, Morales um, pretty much decided to ignore it and chose to run again in 2019. So this kind of brings us to the November 19 elections. So initially, Evo did not win enough votes for clean minority in the first term, and the right wing decided to contest these results because it was a close election. So a second round happened, and yeah, like just the election was too close, and the right wing forces. A lot of these, it's important to know like this kind of right wing government forces are very similar, have strong features of a proto-fascist. Like, and like if you look at the history of Bolivia, there's many of these military coups, many of these like fascist forces that whenever there's huge mobilizations, they try to like repress and all that stuff. So it's important to point out that you don't mess with the far right is pretty big in Bolivia, and it's of course it tends to be richer, whiter, more more from the Spanish European background. So yeah, like so they took advantage of this opportunity. They contested the results, and this opened a standstill in the parliament, and pretty much Evo Morales' party chose to more or less let they some other they kind of chose to ignore the far right, and some of the top people resigned, and that's how someone like Agnes, how her party was able to like why she was put the interim president or prime minister. And yeah, Morales was forced to resign under a threat of the military coup by a military summit, Bolivia. And yeah, he fled to Mexico instead of like putting up a fight. And yeah, so during this period, the Mas was too afraid to put up a fight. And yeah, Agnes's government for a year, for a year tried to revert many of the measures of the progressive measures. And yeah, so our international characterizes this from this kind of government regime from being a bourgeois democratic regime to a military controlled one. So that's important to point out that this kind of to give some background on what happened in the past year. And let's see, what else. Yeah, so there is the Ines regime postponed elections twice in 2020. So they were trying to they knew they would have not won, so they were postponing elections because a lot of the base of the Mas they don't like this. Like the as much criticism as we have of Evo Morales and the Mas, like the reality is the Mas it's a bit it's many of these organizations are grassroots, they're indigenous, they're working class, like they lead the COB, the Trade Union Federation. They have a lot of influence in this, in this trade union central. So as critical as we are of them, it's a very progressive government. Yeah. So let's see. So yeah. So in the span of within the past year, there have been huge mobilizations by the Bolivian masses, even during the coup. So there has been like many mobilizations, and then yeah, so this kind of helps lead to why eventually the Mas won the elections. Evo Morales wasn't able to run, so they put forward the Luis Arce, and yeah, and then so yeah, so people know about the elections. The Áñez government was defeated through the elections, but kind of like gives some characterization of this, like our the international we're part of, and we have a small group there. It's still trying to build itself. It's called the Lucha Socialista, or Socialist Struggle, and yeah, like their characterization is that this coup wasn't defeated just by electoralism. It was all these mass mobilizations, there's mass strikes. This kind of helped help the defeat. There's I'm not gonna go too much into it. There's like kind of a debate about um, what should a socialists have said during the election. Should they have given a critical vote for Mas? There's a long history of giving critical vote for, especially during kind of coup fascist governments of, especially of like social democratic type governments. Our section, they called for a critical vote. They've been a long-term critical history of Mas just because of the military coup government. This is a debate. I'm not going to go into that. They was it wrong or not? I'm not going to go into that. But regardless, like it's important to continue to critique the Mas and Evo Morales because it hasn't really resolved many of the big issues that continue there. So yeah, like what our comrades in Bolivia say is that we can expect pretty much the same thing. The economic recession continues. We have, of course, COVID was a big background of why there's huge mobilizations. Deep economic recession continues. And yeah, so of course, we need to make sure to continue critique Mas and the pink tide government. They've kind of come back with some more popularity, but it's a very tenuous popularity. And if they're not able to deliver the promises, could have the far right could grow again. And yeah, okay, so I think this is it for me on Bolivia. So let me just check. I know I got some messages. So I want to make sure I'm not too much behind. Okay, all right. So the next country I'm going to briefly go over is Peru. Peru. So yeah, so just like Bolivia, Peru, it's another one of the poorer countries in Latin America. There's its biggest economic engines are mining and the agriculture countryside work, manufacturing and fishing. Just some tidbits here. So the Maoist guerrilla Shining Pat had some, was kind of big in the 1980s and 90s, but it led a guerrilla war, and like different factions were killing each other. So it just created a mess for the socialist left there. When a decade or two before, there were like the Trotskyists around Hugo Blanco had a lot of influence. Like our international, like Hugo Blanco comes out of our international tradition. And yeah, like it's another instance where the Trotskyists kind of play a leading role in the agro worker sector. But that was in the 70s, 80s, and the Maoists kind of took over that in the 80s, 90s. So Peru is like pretty much, it's one of the poorer countries in Latin America. It's probably the poorest one. And yeah, and I'll leave it at that. So similar to Bolivia and the rest of the countries that were there have been experiencing all this economic and social economic crisis during the COVID world. So, and we saw that and there's been kind of like what led why we chose why Peru was kind of picked is because there's been all these mass mobilization strikes against the corrupt governments in Peru. So unlike the rest of the pink tide, Peru never had a pink tide government. Instead, it had more of a far right government, Fujimori in the 1990s that helped enact a lot of the neoliberal austerity measures in Peru. And even though there was some mass mobilizations, it wasn't to the extent of Bolivia, Venezuela, and the other pink tide governments. So even now, there's the Fujimori constitution exists. So it's a very very repressive constitution. There's lack of democratic rights, and indigenous population there just isn't as well represented there compared to like if you look at the Bolivia, Venezuela, like these pink tide governments, they have huge indigenous population, which is a new thing. Before it was just white Spanish European people have roots from those countries. So that was a big change for a lot of people. So yeah, here I just include like Peru had one of the most the COVID crisis hit Peru really hard. There's over a million cases, 35,000 deaths. It had the highest number of deaths of capita per death. So that gives some background of why these mass mobilizations happen. And yeah, so there was a scheduled election that was supposed to happen. There was, due to like, but there also had been a lot of corruption charges against the then President Martin Vizcarra. So, the government, the parliament at the time, recognizing kind of this tenuous state, Russian impeachment of Martin Vizcarra. So it was um, more of an impeachment process, not so much of a military coup because there was already a far right government control. Yeah, and like these corruption charges about him accepting bribes and big payouts from a large Brazilian construction company to continue to extract Peru. And yeah, so it's possible these it's most likely these corruption allegations are true, especially because the last six presidents of Peru have had corruption charges that have been proved. So it just shows it's a very corrupt government system. So obviously most Peruvians didn't doubt it. Um, they wanted Vizcarra to face charges, but this kind of rush impeachment was seen as an attack on the democratic rights of Peruvians, and most saw it as a congressional coup. And yeah, after like this impeachment coup process, tens of thousands of people went to the streets to protest during COVID, and yeah, the Peruvian National Police responded with extreme violence, started killing people, wounding people, and this whole situation just created, it only fed fire to the mobilizations. And initially, the Marino, who was um, who's going to replace Vizcarra, was forced to resign. So this is considered the shortest presidential term in Peru's history. And from there, like there was another president that was impeached. So like in the span, there's like two presidents that were impeached, which for Peru is this hasn't happened for decades. So it's definitely very momentous. And right now, like the masses are calling for the end of the Fujimori constitutional government. They're trying to get rid of like all these kind of neoliberal pressures. And yeah, so just I'll give a little background on some of the like more progressive, left governments that have tried to kind of seize these mass mobilizations. So one of the more popular ones is called Frente Amplio or Broad Front. So this was formed by similar to like these other pink tie governments. It was formed by Stalinist Communist Party and some of the social democratic parties. And there's a small Trotskyist group, Unios there. It's from a different tradition than ours. And although I'd recently left because Frente Amplio became the president of the Congress, and this Trotskyist group left. They don't want to be part of this because then this it would become a classical collaboration with government. Yeah, and then for those who follow the situation, there's the mobilizations continue to happen in Peru. So yeah, and then here I just have some pictures of our international. We do have the biggest Trotskyist group there is called the PST, the Socialist Workers Party. They have a lot of money influence, teachers, and other manufacturing sectors. So yeah, so there's a couple Trotskyist groups there, but there aren't that much there. Yeah. So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. I'll leave it at that.